The year is 1846. The United States, a young and ambitious nation, is on the path of expansion. The Republic of Mexico, still recovering from its war for independence, struggles to maintain its vast and diverse territories. In the midst of these circumstances, a conflict brews, one that will shape the future of North America. This is the story of the Mexican-American War. To understand how this war began, we must go back to the early 19th century. The roots of this conflict lie in land disputes, political instability, and the growing concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. The first spark of tension between the United States and Mexico came with Texas. Originally a northern province of Mexico, Texas was sparsely populated and difficult to govern. To stabilize the region, Mexico encouraged American settlers to move into Texas, offering them land in exchange for allegiance to Mexico. However, as more Americans arrived, their loyalty to the Mexican government weakened. By 1836, Texas had declared independence from Mexico after a violent revolution. The famous Battle of the Alamo and the decisive victory at the Battle of San Jacinto sealed Texas's fate as an independent republic, but Mexico never recognized Texas as a separate nation. To them, Texas was still Mexican land, occupied by American settlers. In 1845, the situation escalated when the United States annexed Texas, incorporating it as a new state. This move infuriated Mexico. The border between Texas and Mexico was a major point of contention. Mexico claimed the Nueces River as the boundary, while the U.S. insisted that the border extended to the Rio Grande. Meanwhile, political tensions in both nations fueled the growing hostility. In the United States, President James K. Polk was a strong believer in manifest destiny. He saw Texas as just the beginning. California, New Mexico, and the entire Southwest were potential additions to the U.S. territory. Polk's administration was eager to negotiate with Mexico for the purchase of these lands, but Mexico refused. In Mexico, political instability made negotiations difficult. Leadership changed frequently, and the country was in economic turmoil. Many Mexicans viewed the United States as a growing threat, determined to strip them of their lands. Determined to secure the disputed border, President Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into the contested area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. This was a calculated move designed to provoke a response from Mexico. In April 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and clashed with American forces in what became known as the Thornton Affair. Several American soldiers were killed or captured. When news of this reached Washington, President Polk declared, "American blood has been shed on American soil." Using this as justification, he called on Congress to declare war against Mexico. On May 13, 1846, war was officially declared. The Mexican-American War had begun. Narrator: this was a war between two nations, but also between two vastly different military forces. The United States had a smaller but well-trained army, while Mexico had a larger force but was plagued by internal divisions and logistical challenges. What followed was a brutal and controversial conflict filled with decisive battles, legendary military leaders, and events that would forever alter the borders of North America. Join us in Part 2, where we delve into the early battles and strategies that shaped the course of the war. Previously, we explored the tensions leading up to the Mexican-American War, land disputes, the annexation of Texas, and the political ambitions of President James K. Polk. Now, as war is officially declared, the stage is set for the first major battles of the conflict. This is Part 2 of the Mexican-American War. With war declared, the United States wasted no time in mobilizing its forces. General Zachary Taylor, stationed near the Rio Grande, prepared for battle. On May 8, 1846, the first significant clash occurred at Palo Alto. The Mexican army, led by General Mariano Ariza, had superior numbers, but Taylor's forces had the advantage of better artillery. The U.S. Army's flying artillery, light mobile cannons, devastated Mexican ranks. The battle raged for hours, but by nightfall, Ariza's forces were in retreat. The following day, on May 9, Taylor's troops pursued the Mexicans to Resaca de la Palma, where another fierce engagement took place. Outmaneuvered and demoralized, the Mexican army fled, giving the Americans a crucial early victory. Taylor's success electrified the United States. He was hailed as a national hero, and recruitment for the war effort surged. Meanwhile, in Mexico, morale suffered, and the government struggled to unify its forces. After securing Texas, the United States launched an invasion of northern Mexico. Taylor advanced toward Monterrey, a heavily fortified city considered a key stronghold. On September 21, 1846, the Battle of Monterrey began. American forces encountered fierce resistance as they fought street by street, house by house. The battle lasted 3 grueling days, but ultimately, Taylor's forces captured the city. In an unexpected move, Taylor allowed the defeated Mexican troops to retreat, a decision that was both praised for its humanity and criticized for allowing enemy forces to regroup. While battles raged in Texas and northern Mexico, another theater of war was opening in the West. President Polk had long-eyed California as a prize, and the war provided an opportunity to seize it. In June 1846, American settlers in California launched the Bear Flag Revolt, declaring independence from Mexico. Soon after, U.S. Navy forces under Commodore Commodore John D. Sloat arrived, capturing key ports like Monterey and San Francisco with minimal resistance. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, an American force led by General Stephen Kearny marched from Fort Leavenworth and captured Santa Fe without firing a single shot. The Mexican governor had already fled, allowing the U.S. to take control of the vast territory. By the end of 1846, the United States controlled much of northern Mexico, New Mexico, and California. However, the war was far from over. Mexico was not ready to surrender, and a new leader, General Antonio López de Santa Anna, was preparing to strike back. After being exiled in Cuba, Santa Anna negotiated his return to Mexico with the promise of brokering peace. However, upon arriving, he took control of the army and prepared for a counteroffensive. Santa Anna quickly assembled a large force and marched north, determined to drive the Americans out of Mexico. His next target, General Taylor's army at Buena Vista. The stage was set for one of the war's most decisive and bloody battles. Would Taylor's forces withstand Santa Anna's massive assault, or would Mexico turn the tide of the war? Join us in part 3 as we witness the legendary Battle of Buena Vista and the shifting momentum of the war. Previously, we saw the United States win early victories, securing Texas, California, and New Mexico, but the war was far from over. General Antonio López de Santa Anna had returned to Mexico, gathering a massive army to strike back. The stage was set for one of the most crucial battles of the war, Buena Vista. In early 1847, Santa Anna mobilized an army of over 20,000 men and marched north. His target, General Zachary Taylor's forces, stationed near the small village of Buena Vista. Taylor's army was vastly outnumbered, with only around 5,000 men, but they had a strategic advantage: the rugged terrain. Taylor positioned his troops in a defensive stance along a narrow mountain pass, forcing the Mexicans to attack uphill. On February 22, 1847, Santa Anna launched his assault. Waves of Mexican soldiers charged at the American lines, leading to fierce hand-to-hand combat. At times, it seemed the Mexican forces would overwhelm the Americans. However, the superior training and firepower of Taylor's troops, particularly their artillery, turned the tide. A decisive moment came when Colonel Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy, led the Mississippi Rifles in a daring counterattack, breaking the Mexican charge. After a full day of brutal fighting, Santa Anna withdrew, leaving the battlefield to the Americans. The Battle of Buena Vista was a turning point. Though Santa Anna's forces outnumbered Taylor's, the Americans emerged victorious. This battle cemented Taylor's reputation, eventually propelling him to the presidency. While Taylor secured the northern front, President Polk realized a different strategy was needed to end the war quickly. He turned to General Winfield Scott, a veteran military strategist, to lead a bold invasion straight to Mexico City. Scott devised an ambitious plan. Instead of fighting through northern Mexico, he would launch an amphibious assault on the port city of Veracruz, Mexico's primary gateway to its capital. On March 9, 1847, Scott's army of 12,000 men landed at Veracruz in the largest amphibious operation in U.S. military history at that time. The city was heavily fortified, but Scott used a combination of naval bombardment and a siege to force its surrender on March 29. With Veracruz under American control, Scott's army began its march inland toward Mexico City, but between them and the capital lay mountains, treacherous roads, and Santa Anna's forces waiting for revenge. Santa Anna, determined to stop the American advance, set up defenses at Cerro Gordo, a narrow mountain pass. His army, numbering around 12,000, held the high ground, making an American attack seem nearly impossible. But Scott had a plan. Using intelligence gathered by his engineers, one of whom was a young Robert E. Lee, Scott discovered a hidden path through the mountains. On April 18, 1847, the U.S. forces executed a surprise flanking maneuver, attacking Santa Anna's forces from an unexpected angle. Caught off guard, the Mexican army suffered heavy losses, and Santa Anna was forced to flee, leaving behind his personal carriage containing gold, documents, and even his prosthetic leg, which American soldiers took as a war trophy. With Cerro Gordo secured, the road to Mexico City lay open, but the war was not over yet. Fierce resistance, political tensions, and urban warfare awaited the Americans as they approached the heart of Mexico. The final phase of the war was about to begin. Would the Americans successfully capture Mexico City, and how would this war reshape the future of both nations? Join us in part 4 as we explore the bloody battles of Contreras, Churubusco, and the climactic assault on Mexico City itself. Previously, we saw the fierce battles of Buena Vista and Cerro Gordo, where American forces overcame Santa Anna's army and marched closer to Mexico City. Now, we enter the final phase of the war, the bloody campaign for the Mexican capital itself. With Veracruz secured and the road to Mexico City open, General Winfield Scott led his forces toward the heavily defended capital. Mexican forces, led by Santa Anna, regrouped and prepared for a final stand. The first major confrontation came at Contreras on August 19, 1847. The Mexican army, positioned in strong defensive lines, believed they could halt the American advance. However, under the cover of darkness, U.S. troops executed a daring night maneuver, launching a surprise attack at dawn. The Mexicans, overwhelmed and unable to retreat, were forced to surrender within hours. Following this swift victory, Scott pushed forward to Churubusco on August 20th. Here, Mexican troops made a desperate stand, bolstered by the San Patricios, an elite battalion of mostly Irish soldiers who had defected from the U.S. Army and fought fiercely alongside the Mexicans. Despite their resistance, American forces overwhelmed the defenders. By the end of the day, the path to Mexico City was nearly clear. With the Mexican army in retreat, Scott offered a temporary ceasefire to allow for peace negotiations. However, talks quickly collapsed as the Mexican government refused to surrender any territory. Determined to defend the capital, Santa Anna prepared for the final battle. He fortified key positions around Mexico City, particularly the castle of Chapultepec, one of the most strategic strongholds. On September 8, 1847, the Americans launched an assault on Molino del Rey, a key position near Chapultepec. Believing it housed a major cannon foundry, Scott ordered an attack. The battle turned into one of the bloodiest of the war, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Despite fierce resistance, the Americans secured the position, setting the stage for the final battle. Chapultepec Castle, sitting atop a steep hill, was the last major obstacle before Mexico City. On September 12, Scott's artillery bombarded the fortress, and the next day, U.S. forces launched a full-scale assault. Among the defenders were young Mexican cadets, known as Los Niños Héroes, who refused to surrender and fought to the death. One legend tells of a cadet, Juan Escutia, wrapping himself in the Mexican flag and leaping from the castle walls to prevent the flag from falling into enemy hands. Despite their bravery, the defenders were overpowered, and by midday, the American flag flew over Chapultepec. The remaining Mexican troops retreated, and on September 14, 1847, U.S. forces entered Mexico City. The war was nearly over, but the consequences of this occupation would shape the future of both nations. How would Mexico respond to the fall of its capital? What would the terms of peace be? And how would this war impact the long-term relationship between Mexico and the United States? Join us in Part 5, where we uncover the final negotiations, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the lasting consequences of the Mexican-American War. In our last episode, we witnessed the dramatic fall of Mexico City. The American flag now flew over the capital, and the Mexican government was in chaos. But though the fighting had mostly ended, the war was not yet officially over. Now, the focus turned to peace negotiations and the consequences of the conflict. This is Part 5 of the Mexican-American War. As U.S. forces took control of Mexico City on September 14, 1847, tension ran high. While some Mexicans fled the city, others remained and resisted the occupation. Riots and guerrilla attacks against American soldiers continued, making it clear that the U.S. could not hold the city indefinitely without a peace settlement. Meanwhile, the Mexican government was in disarray. President Santa Anna, disgraced by his failures in battle, resigned and fled the capital. With no central leadership, Mexico struggled to negotiate a way out of the war. In Washington, President James K. Polk wanted a swift resolution. He had achieved his goal, expanding U.S. territory, but he feared that prolonged occupation could lead to further unrest. He sent diplomat Nicholas Trist to negotiate a peace agreement with Mexican officials. Initially, Polk hoped to claim not only Texas, California, and New Mexico, but also additional territories deeper into Mexico. However, Trist, despite being recalled by Polk, continued negotiations and settled on a more limited agreement. On February 2, 1848, Mexican and American representatives signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Under the terms of the treaty, Mexico officially recognized Texas as part of the United States. With a Rio Grande as the border, the U.S. acquired a vast amount of land, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This area, known as the Mexican Cession, added nearly 500,000 square miles to U.S. territory. In exchange, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million and assumed $3,250,000 in debts owed by Mexico to American citizens. The treaty was ratified by both nations in the following months, officially bringing the war to an end. For the United States, the war was a major victory, fulfilling the vision of Manifest Destiny. However, it also intensified internal debates over slavery. The newly acquired territories raised the question, would slavery expand westward? This debate fueled sectional tensions that would later lead to the American Civil War. For Mexico, the war was a national tragedy. The country lost nearly half of its territory, and its economy and government were left in shambles. The wounds of war created long-lasting resentment toward the United States, shaping Mexican-American relations for generations. The Mexican-American War reshaped North America, setting the stage for future conflicts and territorial disputes. It created heroes like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, who would later become political figures. It also shaped military leaders who would fight in the U.S. Civil War, such as Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. But beyond politics and borders, the war left an enduring legacy of cultural exchange, migration, and struggle between two neighboring nations. The war was over, but its consequences would echo for years to come. Join us in Part 6, where we examine how this war shaped the futures of both Mexico and the United States, and how its impact is still felt today. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought an official end to the Mexican-American War, but the effects of the conflict would shape the future of both nations for generations. From political struggles and border tensions to cultural exchanges and historical memory, the war left a lasting imprint. This is part 6 of the Mexican-American War. For the United States, the war was seen as a triumph of manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to expand across North America. The acquisition of vast new territories, including California and the American Southwest, solidified the U.S. as a continental power. However, victory came with deep political consequences. The expansion of U.S. territory reignited fierce debates over slavery. Would these new lands permit slavery, or would they remain free? The Wilmot Proviso, an unsuccessful legislative proposal, sought to ban slavery in the newly acquired lands, highlighting the growing divide between North and South. This debate fueled tensions that would eventually lead to the American Civil War. Militarily, the war provided valuable experience for future leaders. Officers like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and William T. Sherman honed their skills in battle, preparing them for the conflicts to come. For Mexico, the war was a devastating loss. Nearly half of the country's territory was ceded to the United States, creating a lasting sense of betrayal and injustice among its people. The war weakened Mexico's economy and government, leading to political instability for years to come. The loss of land also had deep cultural and social effects. Many Mexicans found themselves living under American rule overnight. Entire communities in California, Texas, and New Mexico had to adapt to a new government, language, and legal system. Despite promises in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that their rights would be protected, many Mexican Americans faced discrimination and land confiscation. The war established the modern U.S.-Mexico border, but disputes did not end in 1848. Tensions continued in the following decades, with occasional military conflicts, disputes over water rights, and migration issues. One of the most significant consequences was the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, where the U.S. bought additional land from Mexico to build a southern railroad route, further defining the border we know today. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, the war's impact can be felt in immigration policies, economic ties, and diplomatic relations between the two nations. The cultural blending of Mexican and American traditions, seen in food, music, and architecture, is another lasting legacy of the war. The Mexican-American War remains a controversial chapter in history. In the U.S., it is often remembered as a successful military campaign that expanded the nation's borders. But in Mexico, it is remembered as La Intervención Estadounidense, a tragic moment of foreign invasion and territorial loss. For historians, the war serves as a case study of expansionism, diplomacy, and military strategy. It also reminds us of the consequences of war, not just for soldiers and governments, but for ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The Mexican-American War changed the map of North America and set the stage for future conflicts. It left behind a legacy of division, resilience, and transformation. The echoes of this war continue to shape modern politics, identity, and international relations. As we conclude this series, we are left with one question: how should history remember this war? A glorious expansion or an unjust conquest? A moment of destiny or a lasting wound? The answer depends on where you stand, but the impact of the war remains undeniable. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. This has been the story of the Mexican-American War.